Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, we analyze the March for Our Lives that took place this past weekend here in Washington and all over the world, and the situation in the Middle East with Medea Benjamin, 3 times nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize and co-founder of Codepink. Medea Benjamin, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jorge.
Tell us once again, what is Codepink?
Codepink is a group that started right after the 9/11 attacks in 2001 with the idea that if we mobilized people around the country, we could avoid a reaction that was even worse, meaning a war. We tried to stop the war in Iraq. We were not successful. And 15 years later, we're still trying to get the U.S. out of wars like in Afghanistan and Iraq, and to stop violence in general, including violence at home.
The students who survived the massacre in the school in Florida recently were the ones who organized this past weekend here in Washington what they call the Mass for Our Lives, the March for Our Lives. We're talking about more than 500,000 people, not only in Washington, all over the U.S. and all over the world. What is your reaction of that movement?
I think it's beautiful. It's amazing. After so many of these shootings that happen, you get a little bit of attention in the media and then it goes away. This time is different. This time is because the students are old enough that they can speak for themselves, not like when there were massacres in elementary schools.
Like in Sandy Hook.
In Sandy Hook. And these students are on fire. I was with them. I went down to Florida immediately after the shooting, and I was just so impressed by them. They're brilliant, they're passionate, they're determined, and they are shaking things up in Washington. They're coming here to meet with their elected officials, they're demanding answers, they're not taking no for an answer, and they're not naive. They know that this is a country that is very corrupt when it comes to the influence of lobby groups, and they are determined to make sure that their voices and the voices of the American people, because the majority of the American people want to see sensible gun control legislation, they want to make sure their voices are really heard.
You were in that march we're talking about a few days ago, and there were not only the students from Florida, there were students from all over the country?
The airports have been full for the entire week, and the buses with students flooding in from all over. And this is in addition to having marches in their own cities. But it's I think this is the beginning of a new generation of activists in the United States. In my generation, it was because of the war in Vietnam. This generation will be about gun violence, and we are seeing it in the walkouts from schools, in the marches, and in the kind of online activism that is happening as well.
Do you believe that it's going to take some impact or priority in the midterms elections at the end of the year, November, here in the United States?
You know, it's tough to say, Jorge. You never know how these things go. There's always some new thing that comes in and takes over all the steam, all the media attention. And also, the Democrats are already probably going to win in the midterm elections.
At least in one of the two chambers.
Yes,
in two chambers.
And
yeah.
that happens most of the time when there is one party in the White House, the other party tends to win in the Congress. But I think this will help give more momentum to the Democrats, because these young people, while they don't really care about party politics, they care about electing people who will help them on this issue. And I think they'll be out there in full force, and it will provide some more momentum.
This past week, the Congress precisely was approving the new budget for 2018 until September, and the only thing that really approved regarding guns was to improve or increase background checks, but nothing else. Means that these students, these kids, has an uphill battle to try to really change the laws. Where is the NRA in all this?
The NRA is so powerful. It's really amazing to see, even with all this student momentum, the NRA still holds sway in Congress. You would think it would be very easy to say, yes, let's raise the age for buying guns to 21. It's logical. You would think it would be easy to say, let's ban weapons that were made for war, assault weapons, and not allow individuals, civilians, to buy these weapons. But it's not possible to do now because of the power of the NRA. So we have the students and all the people supporting the students on one side. We have the NRA and its money and its lobbying on another side. And we'll see what we can get.
Are congressmen and even the President of the United States puppets that are being manipulated by the money of these lobbyists, and they are at their service and not at the service of the American people?
You know, it's not just the NRA money. The NRA also has a grassroots base. And so when Congress people go back to their district, it depends what part of the United States. In more conservative parts of the United States, you get more NRA supporters. In more liberal, you get more people who are behind the students. So it really reflects the divisions in this country in general, and it does show the tremendous amount of power that organized groups with money like the NRA have in our system.
Jimmy Carter, the former president of the U.S., has said, quote, "The U.S. is not a democracy," he says. "It's an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery."
Well, I love Jimmy Carter. I love him more as an ex-president than I loved him as a president. And he tells it like it is. If you go into our Congress today, like I go almost every single day, I'm sitting next to a table full of lobbyists for Northrop Grumman, a big weapons company, or Lockheed Martin, a big weapons company, or the NRA, a big weapons lobby, or the pro-Israel government lobby group, AIPAC. They are everywhere in the halls of Congress. They are constantly putting pressure on our elected officials. And so it really is very hard to call this a democratic country anymore. It is, as Jimmy said, Carter said, a country that is where people who are elected to represent the people are really doing the bidding of wealthy companies and lobby groups.
Something could be done to change it?
I think we're in the midst of seeing a tremendous attempt to take one sector, which is the gun sector, and see if the power of the people can overcome the power of the lobby group. And that's why this fight is such an important one.
And your movement is precisely pointing in that direction.
Well, we are trying to get the NRA out of our schools. We're the National Rifle Association. We're trying to get the NRA out of the pockets of our elected officials. We're trying to decrease the power of the NRA. And let's see if we're successful.
Talking about the permanent crisis for many observers that is taking place in the White House, and the just dismissal or firing of one close advisor of President Trump after the other. What do you think about the new appointment of, we're talking about John Bolton as National Security Advisor?
John Bolton is the worst of the worst. John Bolton is a man who was a U.S. representative to the United Nations but hates diplomacy. He's a guy who's in favor of war. He pushed for the Iraq War. He doesn't admit that it was a horrendous mistake. He is a guy that is pushing for war with North Korea and pushing for war with Iran. So here you have President Trump, who as a candidate said that he wanted to get the U.S. out of these wars, that this was a waste of trillions of dollars and lives of American soldiers. And here he is appointing people like John Bolton, who unfortunately are going to try to take us down the path of more war.
And talking about appointments, he also nominated, at least not already appointed, but nominated Mike Pompeo as the Secretary of State, replacing Rex Tillerson. And we're talking about someone who is considered a hawk, that is pretty much a right-wing person that, for example, regarding Latin America, he was helping to write new, stricter sanctions against Venezuela. He's pushing for regime change, as he called it, and for Latin America also he could mean bad news. what is sort of direction is going Trump with appointing one after the other someone from the very right-wing scope of the American politics?
It seems like what we call the neoconservatives have gotten hold of Donald Trump and have infiltrated within his administration, and these are going to be the people closest to him. Well, we recently were very happy that Donald Trump said he was going to meet with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. Suddenly he appoints Mike Pompeo, and then he appoints the John Bolton, who are the absolute opposite. They are against meeting with the head of state of North Korea. They would rather bomb North Korea. So it is a turnaround from the moderating influence that somebody like the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson have to among the people in this country who are the most hawkish, the most militaristic.
What do you think about the possible appointment, the nomination of the Assistant Director of the CIA as Director of the CIA?
Well, this is a woman, Gena Haspel, and some people are saying, oh, isn't it wonderful, a woman will be heading the CIA. And we say this is not the kind of efforts to give women more authority that we want to see, because she was known as Bloody Gena by people even within the CIA, because she was overseeing a black site in Thailand when there was torture taking place.
Clandestine prisons from the U.S.
Clandestine prisons. She is somebody who, in the days of George Bush, was in favor of using torture. Now, you would think that somebody like that would be in prison right now, because torture is illegal according to any international law. But instead of being held accountable, she is rising up the ladder, nominated to be the head of the CIA.
Rand Paul, the senator, was reading publicly a report that supposedly was the quote of the interrogator that was practicing a torture to a prisoner in one of those clandestine prisons in Thailand. Supposedly Gena was there. First of all, is saying to him, good job, and he was very pleased to see that he was drooling from his mouth, the prisoner in the middle of the torture, enjoying that type of situation. And Ron Paul said, I will never be able to approve the nomination of Mike Pompeo or Gena Haspel because of that sort of background.
There are very few Republicans like Rand Paul who will go against a nomination like Gena Haspel. Most of them will be in favor of it. And there are even Democrats who are going to support her, regardless of that. And I think it's just a terrible reflection on the United States. First is a terrible reflection that we were engaged in torture, and then she was also one of the people who was pushing for destruction of the tapes, because they tape these sessions, destruction of any evidence. And so somebody engaged in torture, engaged in destroying the evidence, that's even a greater crime, but instead she will probably be confirmed in her nomination.
Talking about the Middle East, we hear different versions. In the US, you hear more often that Saudi Arabia and Israel is calling Iran a terrorist country. Iran is telling or is saying systematically that the real terrorists in the Middle East are the Saudis and the Israelis. Who are what?
There are certainly a lot of problems in Iran. I'm not saying it's a model of democracy and that its foreign policy is one above reproach. But if you compare Iran and Saudi Arabia is by far a more repressive country internally. There are absolutely no national elections at all in Saudi Arabia. There is no freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of religion, nothing. And Saudi Arabia is using the weapons it buys from the United States, because it's the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons, to destroy an already impoverished country in Yemen and turn it into the world's largest human catastrophe, where over 1 million people are suffering from cholera, where there is now diphtheria, and where every 10 minutes a child is dying from the effects of hunger and the war.
You have witnessed firsthand the recent visit here to Washington and to the U.S. of the Prince of Saudi Arabia. Tell us about that.
Well, Jorge, it's so surreal to see that his big PR campaign, and we've been talking about the negative effects of lobby groups. He's hired about 24 lobby groups in Washington, D.C. to project his image as one of a reformer, because he has, quote, given something that women have been fighting for a long time in Saudi Arabia, the right to drive, and he is allowing movie theaters to be opened up. And we say, what a ridiculously low bar that is. Why don't we look at what he's actually doing to cause famine and disaster in the world, in the war that he is responsible for in Yemen, or the crackdowns that he is responsible for internally in Saudi Arabia as well. And so his visit here, there were galas and all kinds of festivals in his honor, full of people from the diplomatic corps, full of people from the Trump administration and Congress. And we're saying, how is this possible that somebody who is a war criminal and a king, who has never been elected by anybody, but says because of his bloodline is entitled to be an absolute ruler of his country, should be treated as a worthy head of state? It makes no sense.
Even received at the White House by President Trump.
Red carpet treatment by President Trump, called a great friend. And what really sickened me was to see Trump and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, with Trump holding up these graphs showing all of the weapons that the Saudis have been buying, and knowing that Trump is saying, isn't this wonderful, they're creating all these jobs in the United States, but really what they're creating is the bombing and destruction and starvation of the people in Yemen.
And you were mentioning, because you were watching one of those galas organized throughout the, about 5 days that he stayed here in Washington.
Yes.
And he organized the galas, and he was paying for the galas to say that he was welcome in this country?
He was welcoming himself. He put on galas in a lot of the most important institutions in Washington, D.C.
The Kennedy Center?
The Kennedy Center, a center called the Museum. That's a center for the rights of free speech and free press. It says it on its building. And yet he was hosting a gala there for Saudi art and culture. And we were there saying outside, the art and culture of Saudi Arabia is the art of death, the art of destruction, the art of killing. So yes, it was quite a sort of Disneyland kind of tour in Washington, D.C. that was really sad to see.
But in a way that you were saying that there were, in those galas, there were congressmen, there were people from other embassies in the area. So means that is the showcase of contamination of money controlling the political power here?
Entirely. It was all about money. The people who were in that gala are one way or another getting money from the Saudis. The Saudis have not only purchased massive amounts of our weapons, but they also are using some of that money to insert themselves in the political system. They have entire wings of the most Ivy League schools like Harvard and Yale named after them. They have think tanks in Washington, D.C. that are supposedly objective think tanks that are paid for by the Saudis, and PR firms, lawyers firms, all kinds of places.
You were visiting recently Palestine, and also you were in Israel. And you had the chance to meet with Tamimi, 17 years old, that has become sort of a hero of the Palestine movement. Tell us about what was the incident that made her famous all over the world.
Well, Tamimi lives in a little town called Nabesala in Palestine, and there are daily confrontations with the repressive, what's called IDF, the forces of the Israeli military, that are constantly encroaching on their land, taking land away from them, and they had just had an incident where the Israeli soldiers had shot her cousin in the head. And they were then going onto her property of her home, and she went outside to say, "Get off our property, get out of our home," and slapped one of the soldiers. Her mother was filming that and put that online, and that went viral. Millions of people started seeing it. The Israelis felt humiliated that a young girl would slap a heavily armed Israeli soldier, and so they went and raided her home in the middle of the night, took her out, put her in prison, and were charging her with 12 crimes, including incitement, things that could have landed her 10 to even 20 years in prison. And so...
and what happened in the international reaction?
The reaction internationally was that she was seen as a hero. All over the world, there were billboards, there were concerts, there were all kinds of things calling for her release. For young people, not only in the Arab world, but all over, she has become a heroine. And this international pressure forced the Israeli government to do a plea deal with her and to give her 8 months in prison. Now, why she should be in 8 months in prison for slapping a soldier who is encroaching on her land is ridiculous. But it was seen as a partial victory because she could have gotten so many years in prison.
And she has said, there's no justice, her words, under occupation. We are being treated in an illegal court.
She was 16 years old when this happened. She was put before a military court that has a conviction rate of over 99%. How could anybody say that she could possibly have had a fair trial? And this showed the world the injustice of the Israeli system, that they would take a juvenile, someone under 18 years old, put them in front of a military court for trying to protect her own property.
You, in a moment, it seemed that you were going to be banned to get into Israel. Tell us about that.
The Israeli government said that my organization, Codepink, was banned from Israel, and we wanted to test it out. And so last month, 3 of us went to Israel, and luckily we were able to get in. And I say luckily because we really thought it was important to spend time with Tamimi's family, to go to other places in Palestine that are fighting the occupation, and to come back home and tell their stories. And now we are anticipating Tamimi's release soon and bringing her here to the United States if we can get the visa. Not certain that the United States will allow her in, but if we do, we will be touring with her and her family all over the country because there are so many thousands of people who want to hear her voice.
When you see Benjamin Netanyahu here visiting in the White House in the Oval Office with President Trump, what is your reaction of such a close relationship?
You know, Jorge, we've talked throughout this interview about the power of lobbies, and it's another example when you see this repressive Israeli government who is violating international law every single day with encroachments of settlements, and he is welcomed into the White House and has such a cozy relationship with Donald Trump and Jared Kushner. And I think the largest foreign policy lobby in the United States is called AIPAC, and there again is an example, just like we talked about with the NRA, of how money in politics has created this situation where the United States is on the wrong side of history, whether it's about issues of gun control or issues, for example, around Saudi Arabia or Israel.
So finally, Medea, when you see President Trump causing, as you said, at the Oval Office with the Prince of Saudi Arabia and then the Prime Minister of Israel, is he going to finish his term, you think?
Well, there it becomes more an issue of things like the Russia connection or his cavorting with porn stars. Who knows what will bring Donald Trump down, but I have a feeling he will not last the 4 years. He is a very impetuous man who has made a lot of enemies along the way in those years, and a lot of that will come back at him because he does things so illegally and so immorally that I think something has got to stick and bring him down.
Medea Benjamin, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jorge.